Sautel, the General Manager of Multistar France and Benelux. You're going to talk about figures in investment. And here we're talking about the IRIS project too. We're talking about the trends now these past years. We're going to talk about regulatory developments. Thanks for coming, Christophe. Good morning, everybody. True, these past years, well, we can go back to 2023 now. These figures then, well, we've talked about figures in different panels already this morning. And what can we say on the basis of figures? Talk loud, please. Your message is interesting, and we want to share it. I think you have figures here, collection of figures. Was 2023 a good year? These figures date from the end of November. That's important to point out. And we worked a bit on this last week. We have new figures, so collection this year, it's kind of mixed. Over the past 15 years, if we want to make comparisons, we're kind of in the middle. At the end of December, these are 250 billion in a collection. A little bit of mythology now. We take the value of the fund at the end of the month, the beginning of the month, and this will enable us to calculate the market effect, and we can weigh in the market effect, and that way we have the estimated collection at the beginning of the month. That's about methodology, and the figures are available. These are figures from late December, but these the ones on the screen are from the end of November, but the trends are the same. The year then overall is average, let's put it that way, but there's something interesting to point out. By comparison with other years, we have the bond category and the money market categories. They save the collection because we see at the end of the year 250 billion. Let me go back here to the figures. 196 billion in the money market, and 165 in bonds. So those are important figures to point out in these categories. These categories, then are among the broadest ones, and they meet certain needs. Of course, we can fine-tune these categories, CTF, Monet, and so on. I'm looking at ESMA now. We can go into detail if we want. And we're not used to this, but the monetary market, the money market has gained a lot. We see different colors which indicate a category. The green, that's the money market category, and unlike other years, we have something that's rather regular. Since the end of February, we have money categories here, whereas usually money categories go up and down depending on the month. So it's important to point this out. Now, we can focus on these money categories here on the right. You see this table. We say 2021, 2022. And since February 2023, we have had a collection here, 36 million collected. That is from the money funds. In December in 2023. Why? What is the reason for that? Why? Why, Fabien? I believe that the graph on the left gives us a good indication. We see the performances in the money category in euros. That's the euro money market. We have two categories on the money market. As we see, unlike the last 10 years, we have a performance which is very positive, and we know why. The rise in the interest rates, maybe it won't continue like that every year, but I believe that it'll be even difficult to reach the same level of performance, and this explains to a great degree the level of collection of money funds. This doesn't suit all management companies. Not all propose this time of investment. The fees are quite different depending on the category. Let's talk we can talk about due return, equity balance funds. I want to wind up on that. Looking at the other categories, fixed income, they collect a lot. Here we have a performance indicator. And equity, then, as you see over these past 3 years, we see a certain mistrust. So there's been a drop there in balanced funds. For equity, it's been going up a little, and these categories no longer collect the same as before, but it's still about 12% of assets in Europe. So it is still considerable. Here we have different companies indicated. This table is hard to read, so we're going to give you this information later. But keep in mind that the big management companies, if we take into account money markets, they made profits this year, and some AXA profited less from the situation. You'll have the figures later. The trend is still positive. Would you say overall it's positive, Christopher? Yes or no? I hope so. It depends very much on the performances. Now, 2022 was bad in terms of performances with respect to ESG indices. Here we're talking about ESG connotation funds. Here we have Morningstar indices. Here we can compare it with traditional ones in Europe. What do we see in red, in violet? That's the equivalent with a selection on ESG securities. 2022, we see the difference is important between the red and the violet. 2023, on the contrary, they are practically identical, and it's the same thing if I had taken global equity and traditional ESG. They're practically the same. The performance is about the same. So it's not the performance that is going to explain the ESG evolution, but rather the trends. Here, what do we see? According to Morningstar, the funds which are sustainable and which commit themselves to have ESG management, that is in blue. I should have done the opposite. In green, green on the contrary, it are those funds which are not ESG, according to Morningstar. What do we see? The evolution of the past 3 years, 2021, the ESG and non-ESG funds, you see them collected. 2022, that we see it is positive for the ESG part. As for 2023, we see something which is more mixed, but we can still say that the fact that it's still ESG is still positive for collection. And so that's positive for the collection today, according to Morningstar. ESG funds account for 20% of outstanding funds. That's a little bit more than last year. 19.5%. And as I say, this is according to Morningstar, because what is see that we'll get information from management companies, in particular Article 8 and 9. These aren't labels, but that may be. We see we have another approach here. As we've seen, there's something rather interesting that we see in 8 or 9 article funds. What do we see? We see an analysis here by number of funds. In terms of number of funds, we see that we've increased quite a bit, and more Article 8 funds, but Article 9 funds have dropped. On the bottom, sorry, maybe you can't see it, but in 2022, we've seen a big number of reclassifications or even declassifications following a stricter definition of the ESMA share of Article 9. So we have declassification, approximately, 377 funds in 2022 were switched from Article 9 to Article 8. In 2023, these changes took place to 31 funds were declassified. Then, on the contrary, this time we see return. Article 6 to 8, 2022, there are only 85, but on the contrary, 677. So Article 8 and 9, then either they're new or most of them are funds that have been transformed, that have been changed. from traditional management to an ESG type funds. And so that's Article 8 and 9. So today, 1,300 Article 9 and fewer in Article 8. So 307 and dropping. So 307 by comparison to 1,000. So it's about 25%. That's a fourth of the funds which were downgraded. So I was speaking about outstanding funds. So this is according to Morningstar. We had strict definitions here of what we mean by sustainable. Let's take the sum of Article 8 or 9 funds. Here we see in 2023, 57% of all the funds, and that's 2023. It was Yves Tombeau asked us to make a split between different countries. I hope France is in a good position. Yes, France is in a good position. Here, what do we see? Domiciled funds. And of course, we know that in France, France has a lot of funds which are domiciled in Luxembourg and Ireland. So let's look at the domiciled funds. 48% are in France, are funds which are ESG. And we have something practically totally identical in Belgium and also Austria. Keep in mind that Nordic countries are not as high because they buy a lot of funds which are not domiciled in the Nordic countries. But of course, their appetite is great in terms of ESG. Can we talk about funds, about fees now? Fees, active and passive management now. I didn't say ETF, non-ETF, but there's something new that's emerged, namely active ETFs. This is a problem for us because we don't know how to place them. Here we have indexing consolidates its position in Europe. So what do we see? What do we see that this index management it becomes more and more important overall, more widespread. It accounts for 27% of outstanding percents, and by comparison with 24% last year. Here we're talking about index funds. So that's the second best year in terms of collection, second best year over 10 years, I believe, with a 80% rise by 82, so this is positive for collection. In indexing, that's positive too for collection. As I said, there's a development of ETF management. These are worldwide figures that you see on the screen because active management is still weak, but it's 30 billion in Europe. But this has grown quite a bit in the United States, in particular with a new regulation, the SEC. This made it possible to have less transparency for ETFs, and this made it possible for active managers to choose ETFs as a vehicle for their fund management. So the figures speak for themselves. As of 2019, we see something which is really considerable in terms of active management. This is happening too in Europe. We have management companies in France which engage in this activity. And so this is something that is developing fast. 4.8 million collected, billion rather, in Europe last year, 4.8 billion. It's not enormous yet, but it's still something that we're studying. And we see this to a greater degree in the bond part with the ETFs, which are objective in bonds, rather. See, look at these two lines. Then they are issues in terms of numbers of ETFs, which are active or passive ones, and the outstanding funds which correspond to them. So they're not majority, but they are growing. And these are worldwide figures here. Let's talk about fees now. That's important too. That's an important subject. We've seen this in particular with the two previous panels in terms of value for money. So what is the and we've talked about the trend too. Alexander Koch talked about that. What do we see? Inflation everywhere except for fees. The fees are dropping in active management, also passive management. What did we do? We took three Morningstar categories, for four rather, in order to estimate the evolution of fees. We see representative categories. First of all, overall, and then we broke it down, passive and active management, and ESG and non-ESG, so it's very clear. In all funds, we see a drop, -10% between 2016 and 2023. As for passive management, there's a drop there too, -21%. And there's a less of a drop in absolute terms, however. It's 0.42, and dropping down to 0.36. For ETFs, I have to get used to this. Well, then there's something else that's interesting to look into. ESG management is less costly. It's less costly in active and passive management. There too, we see a trend which is dropping. But it's interesting to see because it's counterintuitive, but it's not new. And we have different explanations for that. First of all, ETF, they want to attract us in management companies, especially. I said ETF, ESG rather, and maybe there are fees which are not as high, so ESG was doing better. But often we're talking about big companies that do this, so the fees are lower, and their funds which are more recent or which have been changed recently, so the trend downward is greater there. This is what we can see here. Now, what about the large cap blend equity? Well, the same trends then in blend equity as before. We see the same trends. There's a drop. The difference is great between passive and active management. So no comment here. I just wanted to give you the figures. And then we have a diversified bond. Here we see a drop too, but passive management is rising. Here it was -20. It was percent, but the fees have risen for passive management. For ESG, this time ESG is more costly than the passive part. On the contrary, for the bond part, it's the same. Because the fees are lower. It was -20. Now it's -12.15. What about euro moderate allocation? I didn't mention the passive management here because there's practically none here. Here we hear a drop in fees, which is rather limited. In fact, it's stable. I'm going a bit fast here. Here we something that's important too, because this has been discussed much. This is one of the objectives too. RIS, does it favor investment in European companies to develop our economy in Europe? I want to talk about this now. So this is one of the objectives of this RS strategy, namely to encourage savings in Europe toward investment in companies in order to meet financing needs of European companies. If we invest in funds, how did we calculate this allocation? Morningstar then brought together all the holdings to give us a precise vision of all the investments which are taking place in these categories. In particular, there are clear categories. There we see where the funds go. There are global categories, U.S. categories, 76 40% of outstanding funds will be invested in European companies. This is not including the UK. And so what is the conclusion here? This we do by category. We multiply it by the outstanding funds in each category. This enables us to see that 46% of outstanding funds are oriented toward Europe, and this is in line with the possibility to orienting savings in investments in Europe. So we see these fine-tuning here of categories with different values, growth values, large cap, small cap. This meets needs mentioned in previous panels. Extremely interesting. Maybe Yves Tombeau would like to react. I don't know if he wishes to. Yves, maybe you'd like to react. All this is very dense. We have lots of information here. This is very instructive. Christopher, maybe you'd like to add something. No, that's okay. All right. Yves, would you like to come up to the lectern? Global Fund now. There's lots of information. These trends are very interesting. I think they are very interesting. In particular, this what you see here on the screen. I think that this is a roadmap. I see Tanguy is reacting. I think it's a roadmap because indeed we can explain to the average person here. I don't know who mentioned this, the average citizen. Well, we want to reorient our investment and not into just the classical savings bank, but we want them to be invested in the real economy. And I think there's some work to be done here. This is a figure that I'd like to look at, and this represents funds, but not bonds. But this element, I believe, is quite important. But this shouldn't be viewed negatively. As I said, it's a roadmap, and that's how I put it. The drop, we've all agree on that. There's been this drop. A question for the audience. A microphone for the person who is asking the question. Mrs. Martins, Yevshi. Here's my question. It's about ETF. What is the breakdown here? The European and ETF. What is the share breakdown here? The break between European indices and well, no. Here's what I mean. ETFs. You talked about 160 billion, and do you have the split here between ETFs on which are indexed versus global? Those which are European and non-European, what is the split? I want to see this breakdown. I don't have the figure in mind, but we do have this information. I can send it to you. We will add it to the presentation, which will be distributed to you. Now we can move on. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for this presentation. Thanks, Yves Tombeau, for reacting.